Hello, everyone. Please, we're going to be starting out. My name is Alexei. I'm a junior at Yale. I grew up in Ukraine and currently serve as the president of the Ukraine House at Yale. Ukraine House is a cultural student organization dedicated to promoting discourse about Ukraine on campus. The event is also co-hosted by the Alexander Hamilton Society, which is a foreign policy student organization aimed at raising future American national security leaders. Professor Snyder? Yeah. Before proceeding, I would like to thank to everyone from the Ukraine House and the Alexander Hamilton Society for all your work and your contribution to this event. Please give them a round of applause. The event is sponsored by the Jackson School of Global Affairs, the European Studies Council at Dick Macmillan Center, and the Russian, East European, and Eurasian Studies program. Thank you, sponsors, for making this event possible. All of you should have received a placard with a QR code. This is our fundraiser. It's a fundraiser organized by the Razom for Ukraine. It's a nonprofit, one of the largest Ukrainian nonprofits dedicated to humanitarian relief. With your generous donations, we will purchase electricity generators for Ukrainian hospitals in the East so that Ukrainian doctors can still provide care and save lives, even when Russia destroys power lines to the hospitals to finish up the patients it wounded. Ukraine will be grateful for your donation. Today marks the first year since Russia unleashed a murderous, full-scale assault on Ukraine. We saw the price one pays for freedom, ravaged cities and tens of thousands of murdered soldiers and civilians. Yet, we also saw the price one pays when freedom is lost. As Ukrainians liberate their territory, we uncover the horrors of Russian occupation, torture chambers, rape victims, and mass graves. This is what happens when freedom and independence are no more. This year, we also realized that the Ukrainian military can secure this freedom. Before last February, many feared Kyiv would fall, Zelenskyy would escape, and Ukraine would lose. They said 3 days. 3 days. These forecasters couldn't be more wrong. The Ukrainian people proved stronger than Russian armor. 366th day, Kyiv stands free. At last, this year, Ukraine showed us that democracy can win. Freedom has been brought back to hundreds of thousands of people when Ukraine liberated them from Russian occupation. 63%. That's how much previously occupied territory Ukraine has liberated. 63%. You're halfway done. But democracy cannot win on its own. Democracy needs strong military, brave people, and faithful allies. This is when victory comes. But can we win already this year? Could 2023 become the year of victory? The first global victory since the Soviet Empire's collapse in 1991? Or may 2023 mark the year, another year of a worthwhile but tragic struggle against the Russian horde? And when we look back onto 2022, what place will history reserve for the first year of this war? We'll explore these and other questions during the coming panel with our 3 honorable guests. Please join me in welcoming our first speaker, Timothy Snyder. Professor Snyder is the Richard C. Levin Professor of History at Yale University. Professor Snyder is one of the most prominent Ukrainian historians these days. He is an author of best-selling books such as On Tyranny, The Road to Unfreedom, Black Earth, and Bloodlands. His research revolutionized the understanding of mass atrocities and their role in history. Professor Snyder is also an ambassador for the United 24 fundraising platform initiated by President Volodymyr Zelenskyy. Professor Snyder is beyond just being a friend of Ukraine. He is the largest asset Ukraine has in the American intellectual sphere. Our next speaker Our next speaker is Konstantin Usov. Please join me in welcoming him on stage. Mr. Usov is the acting Deputy Mayor of Kyiv. He stayed in the capital of Ukraine when the invasion happened last February and governed despite Russian tanks coming miles away from his office. Mr. Usov was responsible for evacuating civilians in Kyiv's vicinity, including from Irpin and Bucha, where the worst Russian atrocities were committed. Right now, Mr. Usov is currently studying on his mid-career MPA program at Harvard Kennedy School of Government. Before assuming the office in Kyiv as the deputy mayor, Mr. Usov served as the member of the Ukrainian parliament and fought dearly for strengthening Ukrainian independence. Thank you for coming. It is also a pleasure for me to introduce our moderator, Marci Shore. Professor Shore is an associate professor of history at Yale. She teaches Central and Eastern European intellectual history. Professor Shore is the author of many well-praised books: The Ukrainian Night, An Intimate History of Revolution, Caviar and Ashes, A Warsaw's Generations, Life and Death in Marxism, and The Taste of Ashes, The Afterlife of Totalitarianism. Professor Shore is also a regular columnist at the world's most read media: Wall Street Journal, Foreign Affairs, New York Times, The Atlantic, you name it. Professor Shore has been published everywhere. It is a most honor for me to welcome Professor Shore and to let her take over the floor from me. Thank you for coming.
Thank you. Oh, that's the recording?
Yeah,
Is this for?
it's for recording. It will not be here.
Oh, it's not for recording, but do you have a?
Project?
Okay. I always try to grab a microphone because my voice doesn't project naturally, especially well. Maybe I'll try to stand up here. I am touched and gratified to see so many of you here. This is Konstantin doesn't know yet, but for a Yale event, this is a huge audience. We rarely get this many people. I've been touched and gratified this whole year by how many of our students and colleagues have come out in solidarity. It's been in some ways a very special time to be part of a community of those of us who work on Eastern Europe. And I've seen my friends and colleagues from all different fields in East European studies, including the people who teach, Tolstoy and Pushkin, who have mobilized to do everything they can to support Ukraine. But I'm just going to say a few words and try to kind of mentally and imaginatively take you all back to this moment a year ago, because this is the occasion on which we're gathering. It's a very macabre anniversary. And as a historian, I like trying to get people to make an imaginative leap into times and places where we ourselves were not. Now, we were all around a year ago, so it's less distant, but I'm going to kind of imaginatively take you back for just a couple minutes before I turn this over to Konstantin and Tim. A year and a few days ago, I was working on a piece for the Wall Street Journal, and everybody was asking, is Putin going to invade Ukraine? Is Putin going to invade Ukraine? And I kept saying that One, historians' best case scenario, we can tell you what already happened. We can't tell you what's going to happen tomorrow. But I also kept saying I have no privileged epistemological access to what's going on inside that man's head. And my editors were saying, but you're sure that if Russia invades, Ukrainians will fight? And I said, yes, I'm sure. And they said, how do you know? And I said, I don't know how I know. I just know they will fight. And one of the things that struck me later when military strategists said, well, that attack on Kyiv where they had this whole line of tanks in full view going to Kyiv and officers were sent without enough supplies for more than a few days and everyone had their dress uniforms and they were preparing for a victory parade in 3 days. And I thought, well, that's very strange because anyone who has ever spent an hour in Kyiv knows that nobody was going to be happy to see the Russian army there. You don't have to know Russian, you don't have to know Ukrainian. You could show up in Kyiv for an evening, you could have dinner and go to a concert, and you would know enough to know that nobody wanted to see the Russian army in Kyiv. A few days before the invasion on February 19th, our friend Slava Vakarchuk, the Ukrainian rock star who has a special connection to this university because he did a sabbatical here in 2015 at the Yale World Fellows Program. Slava called from Kyiv on February 19th, and I said, Slava, how does it feel in Kyiv? What is the atmosphere like? And he said, well, Marci, kind of imagine being in Florida in October 1962 during the Cuban Missile Crisis. And imagine being in Central Europe in the summer of 1939 after the Munich Agreement and before the Nazi invasion of Poland. It's something like a fusion between those two moods. On February 21st, Putin gave that speech, saying, I will, you want decommunization, I will teach you about decommunization. On February 23rd, I had two friends, Polish friends, one of whom was actually in the hospital going through chemotherapy, who texted me and said, have you listened to what Zelenskyy just said? And I said, no. And she said, okay, we're leaving the hospital and coming right over. So our friends literally went right from the cancer hospital to our kitchen to play for me the speech that Zelenskyy had just given as an address, not to Putin and not to Ukrainians, but to ordinary Russians. And many of you may remember that, but what he said then was different from any tone I had heard him take before. And he said, I'm speaking to you now, not as the Russian government, not as the Kremlin. I'm speaking to you as ordinary Russian people. And don't do this. Don't come here and try to kill us. If you come here, and try to kill us, well, we will defend ourselves. The famous now line where he says, you won't see our backs, you will see our faces, we'll look you in the eye. But this is not the relationship we want to have with you. This is not what we want. And that speech kind of blew me away. There was something in it that was so real and that was so intimate. Only a native speaker could have spoken like that to other native speakers. And I thought, that's got to reach people. That's got to reach people. And then, as you know, a few hours later, the full-scale invasion of Ukraine began. And all around the world, people were saying, we give them 72 hours and there's no way Kyiv can stand. And as everybody knows, the Americans offered to evacuate Zelenskyy and his family, who were targeted for assassination. And Zelenskyy, with his team, came out onto the streets in the dark at night in Kyiv and filmed that selfie video, in which he said, "Ja, Präsident tut." I, the president, am here. And I thought, regardless of what happens afterwards, that was a historical moment. That was an existentialist moment of decision making where one man made a choice, and regardless of what he had done before or what would happen afterwards, that choice was going to turn history. You know, he decided to stay, and he decided to fight. And we've been watching things that are extraordinarily unexpected. You know, it's a kind of great example of what Hannah Arendt called the human capacity for natality, to put in motion something new. And what distinguishes human beings from other animals is the ability to do what is absolutely unexpected. So with that, I'm going to turn it over first to Konstantin, and I'm going to ask him to describe his experience at the beginning of the war. Yes, yes, the first 72 hours or so of the war in Kyiv.
Yeah, since that doesn't work, I'll try to project. I remember 72 hours perfectly because everything on February 24th started rather early. Now I was woken up by a call of a special officer in a Kyiv city administration who was actually calling everyone and saying that mayor is summoning for a meeting at 5:40 a.m. Yeah, and this one. Yeah. So we were there. Obviously, we could hear what was happening, and my area, just so you guys know, was transportation and mobility in the city, and that suddenly became the most important area, and I was not happy with the workflow that I experienced because so the first signal that I got professionally was that a lot of hundreds of people got traumatized next to the entrances to the tube station because the traffic of people was so huge that turnstiles could not let people in fast enough, that the traffic jams towards the western part of the country to Lviv and consequently to the border with Poland in European Union were immense. And you know, time felt very differently back then. And you know, I remember making 100 decisions per hour, not only talking about myself, I'm talking about every branch of government, every branch of government, every department of the mayor's office, and that happened all across the country on every level. So, you know, decision one, all public transportation is free, and we have to open all the doors and all the gates so people can get in freely. Decision two, we don't have enough drivers to operate our municipal bus fleet because half of the drivers were also in a line of people escaping the city, taking their wives and children out of the threat. So what do? We need people who can drive buses. So we post on Facebook that, hey, guys, we need to drive 1,500 buses here right now. If you have any experience in this, just let us know. We'll hand out the keys to you. And that happened within 2 hours. All our fleet was operating. Then we recalibrated the traffic light system to make it one-way wave, you know, towards the exit of the city. And also remember not having any direct orders from my superior, who is the mayor of Kyiv, for the whole day. And I also know that he did not have any orders from his superiors for the whole day. So suddenly the structure of power and the dynamics of leadership switched to a complete whoever can take the initiative, takes it, and governs. And you know, this strange thing that authority does not always mean leadership became very evident. And you could see people with very little authority exercising a lot of leadership and making the most crucial, critical decisions for the first day. Was it scary? Oh, I think it was. Was it thrilling? Oh, yes. And you know, by the end of the day, and probably the second day, I learned a very, very strange thing that was happening in me and in many other people around who I observed at the top of their performance capability. There is a binary during war, and that binary makes you very, very efficient, very fast. And that's a binary, you know, there is no gray zone. It's only black and white. It's only action or inaction. It's being courageous or being coward. And that creates factions that tend to grab all the power, authority, and control. And eventually those not that small factions took over the whole government system in whole Ukraine and made it a very fast bureaucracy, governing apparatus, as opposed to what traditional bureaucracy tends to present. We had a guy in our team who left. He was also a deputy mayor. And the speed at which he was fired sent a signal to many. On the national level, President Zelenskyy was really fast in putting people together. And, you know, all those meetings were organized through Zoom. They were remote. So he had governors for a separate meeting. He had someone else for a separate meeting. And at one meeting, and I know about that personally, because Kyiv is just another region in the country. It's the biggest one, it's the capital, but it's still first among equals. And then President Zelenskyy saw a window where more than one governors were sitting together at one table. And he saw the governor from the Dnipro region and a governor from another region. Let's say it was much closer to a frontier line. And President asked, "Hey, what are you doing there? You're supposed to be back in your office." And he was like, "Hey, Mr. President, there was a protocol that if something happens, we take crucial people into other place." And he was interrupted instantly, and with a very colloquial, I would say informal language, he was explaining that he's got 2 hours to get back. And if he does not participate in a Zoom session in 2 hours from his office, he does not have his office anymore. And that was day one. So that was fast. That was, surprising as to how government, state, and bureaucrats can operate when there is a time of need. And it was very comfortable in terms of, it was very obvious. What should you be doing? That's my memory.
Is this working now? Yes. So can you also then go back to where you were mentally a year ago and describe to the audience how you understood the situation at that time, at that moment, and then perhaps how it's changed?
Yeah, I can. I guess I'd like to preface it by saying that, those of us who observed not only our observations, but also the time we've had to make these observations to those people who were actually there. It's very important not to separate your reflection about what's going on from the people who allow you to reflect, right? So one thing which is very important for me, and I've been saying this since the beginning of the war, is that we understand that the first, from the moment that Russia invaded Ukraine, those first minutes, those first hours, those first days, weeks, months, now a year, all of that in some important way is time that we owe to the Ukrainians. That we can try to work this out, we can try to make sense of it, we can try to do the right thing. But if it weren't for the Ukrainians, we wouldn't have the time to do any of that. And as I'll make the point that Konstantin made, but in a slightly different way, if it weren't for their reactions, we wouldn't be living in some neutral world. We'd be living in a much worse world. We would now be spending our time this year. It's right now we would be asking, why do China and Russia dominate the world? Why is democracy doomed? Right? Are all of our mood, not just our discourse, but our mood, and mood is very important, would be very different if it weren't for the fact that the Ukrainians did the kinds of things that Konstantin is describing in that first day, and then those first days, those first weeks, those first months. As for me, I was comforted. I was on television last night, and they showed me a clip of what I had said the night of the war. From February 24th, I was on the same television show, and I was very comforted to see myself saying already on February 24th, this does not seem to be going the way that the Russians thought it was going to go. So I had no idea. I didn't remember being right, honestly. I remembered being concerned. I mean, but so for me, I guess I would single out a few aspects of this. Number one, I mean, I think very much like Marci and like a lot of Ukrainian friends, to be clear about this too, it was hard to imagine that Russia was going to invade given what one knew about Ukraine, right? So it was hard to imagine yourself all the way to that point, not just of ignorance, but of a kind of active misunderstanding that would lead you to think that you could invade Ukraine with 190,000 troops. It's a big country. It's a big self-aware country. And, the other thing that I had in mind that maybe other people didn't have so much is that in 2014, Russia actually failed on the battlefield. I mean, it succeeded in the so-called hybrid war. In 2014, when Russia managed to take over Crimea and a bit of the Donetsk and Luhansk oblasts, it succeeded in the hybrid war. It succeeded in cyber. It succeeded in getting people in the West to talk about other things besides what was actually going on. There's a reason why almost nobody in the West now talks about the Russian invasion in 2014. They use various euphemisms. And the reason why is that in 2014, most of us in the West fell for some kind of Russian story or another. But in military terms, in political terms, they actually failed then. They were trying to take 6 whole oblasts of Ukraine, and they ended up with 1 and parts of 2. So it didn't really work out that well for Russia that time around. And by 2022, the Ukrainian armed forces were in a completely different position. So I had trouble imagining that they were actually going to do it. I mean, I thought they think the Biden administration is weak. They're going to try to break the Biden administration. The other thing which is worth remembering about a year ago for all of us, and I, as a historian of foreign relations, was thinking about this, the Biden administration was right. Like, they were right that Russia was going to invade Ukraine. And that's important, like you never, if you follow American media, you're not going to hear very many people say like, oh, the president was right. That's not how we roll. But the way we roll is the president may have just saved the world, but look, does his tie match his shoes? Or the president may have just saved the world, but that's probably bad for his reelection chances because the anti-world coalition is large, right? And so it's very important. So one of the things which was on my mind, answering Marci's question, is that the Americans for weeks had been trying to persuade people that this was going to happen and basically failing. And by the end of it, like I almost had the feeling that they were trying now to convince themselves, because nobody was listening, right? Nobody was listening. And by the end of it, there was almost this kind of desperation. Like, we know this is going to happen. Will somebody please believe us, in anywhere, Berlin, Paris, Kyiv, we'll take whatever, we'll take whatever. But that was another weird part of that moment, is that the Americans actually got something right. They were absolutely right about what's going to happen. And so there was an oddity about it happening, just like the Biden administration said it was going to happen, then it happened. But the thing which was the reason why I had trouble, the other reason I had trouble with it speaks to something which is then happening, something which has to do with the difference between then and now, is that there was no Russian propaganda preparation for this. In 2014, I predicted that Russia was going to invade Ukraine. And it's one of my great proud achievements in life is that I got the New York Times to let me publish that, that Russia was going to invade Ukraine. Because that opinion in 2014 was so far out that even people like Ann Applebaum and Serhiy Plokhy, who could not be accused of being anti-Ukrainian, were shaking their heads at how radical I was being. But I was right. Like, Russia was going to invade Ukraine in 2014. But the reason I thought that was because of the propaganda buildup and the dehumanizing rhetoric of Russian propaganda in late 2013. This time around, there wasn't that. I mean, I think this time around, the Russian propaganda apparatus was not preparing Russians or anybody else for this. And so that, that's something which confused me at the time. And I think confused a lot of other people, from Lavrov on down. I think a lot of people in the Russian state did not know this was happening either, which leads us to the difference between then and now. Because then it really was true, that Putin and 2 or 3 other people planned what they really believed was going to be a special military operation in which Ukraine really was going to fall in 3 days. And I think for a lot of us, like, those 3 days were hugely important, because once we got out of those 3 days, it was like history started again. It was like history started again. I mean, like Marci, I had no doubt that the Ukrainians were going to fight. And like a lot of people in the West with Ukrainian friends, I was calling up my Ukrainian friends, and they were basically saying, look, it's a lot. I mean, this sounds very strange, but they would say, it's not as bad as you think it is, right? Like, that was generally the tone that Ukrainians in Ukraine took with Westerners. It's not as bad as you think it is. Well, I see the tank and it's like a kilometer from your house. No, it's not nearly as bad as you think it is. And then they would come up with reasons like, look, we've been fighting for 8 years. We're not surprised. We're not surprised by this. We're ready for this. And there was this interesting phenomenon of Ukrainians calming Westerners, which is something that I want to remember, especially from those first few weeks, when I think it was very important, where Ukrainians were actually exporting calm to the rest of the world. And I think that also links to this last year, because I think in a profound way, the Ukrainians have been exporting calm or sanity to everyone else, not just by way of comparison to Russian propaganda or Mr. Putin, right? I mean, I think of what's happening in Russia as a kind of vacuum where there's not a positive ideology. There isn't anything, there's nothing. They're not invading Ukraine because they have an idea about the future. They're invading Ukraine because there's a vacuum at home. And they're filling that vacuum with their descriptions of conspiracies and how people are out to get them. But they're also exporting sanity to us, because our first reaction, and I remain ashamed of this Western reaction. Our first reaction was, how does this affect us? Maybe this is going to happen. Maybe there's going to be a war in Europe, or maybe there's going to be a nuclear war, and we give ourselves the cheap and frankly pornographic thrill of imagining that there's going to be some kind of nuclear exchange and how this is really about us. And I found that shameful, and the Ukrainians have been exporting sanity in the sense that they've been reminding us that, look, the war's in their country. They're the ones who are taking the risks, and what they really just need is a certain amount of help. And they've been defining for us what kind of help that could be. And so I have this profound sense, finishing now, that in the last year, what the Ukrainians have been doing is that they have been helping to keep us sane. That there was a decisive moment in February where, just by resisting and by setting an example, as Marci already said, they reminded us that you can resist and set an example, that you don't just have to be bowled over, right? Okay, one more anecdote. I was on TV the Sunday before. This is all about how I was on TV now, but I was on TV the Sunday before the invasion, on an American television show called 60 Minutes. And they asked me, is Zelenskyy going to run? And I said, no, Zelensky's not going to run. He's a big guy. He's a little guy used to resisting big guys. He's not going to run, right? And that caused like a furore because everyone in America was sure that Zelenskyy was going to run. 2 days later in this university, there was a panel in a class held by a colleague who invited the national security advisors from the Trump administration and the Obama administration to comment on that clip of 60 Minutes where I said Zelensky's not going to run. And they all said he's going to run, he's going to run, he's going to run, he's going to run, he's going to run. It was a bipartisan consensus that he was going to run, which is of course remarkable, right? We should be pleased. There's agreement. But what I think that showed is a lack of imagination about what's possible in politics. And I'm just now closing in on where Marci left, that Zelenskyy, but not just Zelenskyy. I mean, Zelenskyy is important, but he stands in for everybody else who did their jobs. And as Konstantin said, did more than their jobs or figured out what their jobs really were under pressure. By remaining, they sent us this big lesson in sanity, in the sense that, look, Americans and everybody else, if you want to live in a democracy, democracy is not about freaking out and thinking about how does this concern me? That's not actually democracy, right? That may be psychoanalysis, or it may be that your state has not yet legalized cannabis. There are many things that could be, but democracy does not mean freaking out when there's pressure and then asking about how it's all about you, right? Democracy and freedom are going to involve sometimes taking some risk, being calm and taking some risk. And that to me is a very sane lesson, which in the last year I've been trying to take in.
Yeah, on being calm and being active, I think I can give you some stories. Yeah, I think the most underestimated moment of cultural change in Ukraine was when a decision was made to randomly distribute rifles on the streets of Kyiv, which is claimed weaponry that we could access, and we put it on trucks that we use to repair roads, and we sent those trucks to different districts of the city to distribute them to any man who was willing to take them. And I was thinking that if there is a notion of referendum, of a trust to each other, and of trust of state to its people, that was that moment when the trust was absolute. There was a despair part of it, there was a resistance part of it, but there was also a trust part of it. Another moment that might present you a vivid picture of what life in Kyiv in the office of government looked like was when we were approaching a 10 p.m. when our usual last evacuation train from Kyiv to Lviv was about to depart. And we got a call from one of our intelligence agencies asking to delay the train by an hour, which sounds much easier than it was, because train was a train full of standing, packed women and children that were desperately willing, to go somewhere safer. And we were like, hey, we're not doing it. And they're like, no, you're doing it because we need something to put on this train. And by the way, can you go and grab it? And I'm like, what? And where? And they're like, you'll see. So please send. It's just one SUV. We just need one SUV. Get it sent to a really distant, far, old garage cooperative. Like a set of individual, privately owned, old Soviet garages. and you'll see, and there will be at one garage with the smoke going out of a pipe. So we sent somebody there, and we found a senior man, probably age of 80, and he was smoking a pipe. Yeah, and he's like, "Oh, boys, you came." Yeah, I got that stuff from 1960 when I stole it from some Soviet depot. I don't remember. And he showed that he had like 12 dozens, no, like 2 dozens of fresh smelling wire tires for fighter jets. And since those tires are no longer produced, they are Soviet tires for Soviet fighter jets. And you guys know that we are desperately looking for some birds to operate for Ukraine right now. Yeah. Yeah. So, and our planes were operating 24/7, literally. There was no pauses. And those tires turned out to be a bottleneck. Shortage of tires, you can't operate the plane, you can't land it. And then there was a guy, he probably stole it back then. And then he called security agency and told them that he had them. And by that time, number of planes were literally unoperating because of that shortage. So the train was delayed, the tires were delivered to the train, they were put into a compartment of the train, and women and children were traveling to Lviv next to a tires for fighter jet. And that was exactly what was happening all across the country. And the whole society became a huge, one united beehive where everyone helped everyone. I felt very emotional when I saw that very different people actually have this capacity of cooperating with each other in this particular way. And in this, I saw the biggest hope of the moment.
I'd like to open this up for questions from the audience, in particular from the students, since the three of us could speak to one another indefinitely, but you're all here. So let me see. Yes, please.
Like to start?
Yeah. So I have no political aspirations, so I'm happy to talk about things that I got wrong and buy those who might a little time. The thing that I got wrong, maybe not in the first few days, but I think the thing that I got wrong in the first few weeks was the Russia mobilization in Russia. So my take was that it had to work as a quote unquote special military operation because Putin would be afraid to mobilize. And that's not entirely wrong. I mean, he clearly doesn't like mobilization. But when he was forced to do it by 5 months in, he clearly didn't want to do it. But my thought was he's not going to be able to do it at all. Like he's going to have to finish this very quickly because he's not going to be able to mobilize. And so a mistake that I made was I didn't think Russia could get to the equilibrium point where it is now. They're now at a different equilibrium point, which is because we're dying, it must make sense, which is a typical equilibrium point in war. Because we're dying, it must make sense. That's where they are now, at least a lot of them. And I didn't think they would ever get there. That doesn't mean they're going to be able to stay there or that there are that many more young men to be mobilized. They're not. But that's something that I got wrong. I didn't think that Russia would be able to stick it out this long because I thought Putin would be afraid to try to mobilize. I mean, I've got more if you don't,
I was wrong about the speed of the Western response. So we usually start with saying thank you and expressing a profound gratitude to our European and transatlantic allies, because this life support line is really critical for Ukraine right now. But after this year, I can still see that the reference point for Ukrainians and for our neighbors, some of the Baltic states, some of our close neighbors like Poland, the reference point for us is very different from the reference point for our partners, US included. And again, we are super thankful for everything. We understand and recognize that without this, our chances would have been very dark. But I think that our biggest goal now is to shift the reference point, and I'm happy to explain. So we think that there is no secret that the sense of urgency for those in help, for those in need, and to those helping are different. That's why we keep in our mind a list of weaponry that we urgently need and that we did not get. Contrarily, our partners keep in mind the list of what they have given. The difference is that something that was given to Ukraine helped Ukrainians to survive this year. Something that was not given to Ukraine enabled Russia to continue the war. And I would dream about convincing all our partners is that that the goal is not to help Ukraine not lose. The goal is to help Ukraine to win. And there is a huge, profound difference in winning versus not losing when it comes to international security, law, and order, if we want and honestly aspire to achieve one for a long term. Frozen conflicts tend to be re-emerging conflicts. That's why Ukrainians do not believe in a temporary ceasefire, in territorial compromises. The general sentiment on the ground is that, hey, we've tried back in 2014, we were not ready, we probably were not prepared enough, and we saw in 2022 how previously occupied Crimea and other territories of Ukraine were used as a basement for the next offense. We can't not resolve it, because not resolving it means that senior generation, my middle-aged generation, decides to hide and pass the bloody conflict that takes away not only certainty, motivation for the whole nation, but the hope. We are passing this conflict down to the next generation, to my children. My son Lev is here, by the way, listening to me. Could you raise your hand, Lev? And you know that you can now meet in Ukrainian trenches people of all demographic and social representation. You can see a former homeless guy holding the same rifle as a former Supreme Court justice next to each other. They are eating from the same plate right now, and they both share the sentiment. So that's a big thing. Another big thing after the year is that I think that Ukraine and a lot of European societies have changed, learn how to trust each other again, learn how to rely on each other again, became less divided, became what's very important, less skeptical. And, you know, for our country, this is a big thing because for the whole Soviet period, we were taught to not trust each other. We were taught to hate the state. We saw the government and the state as an enemy who tries to suppress, punish, divide, and destroy creativity and entrepreneurship. It's in the past now. And that's a breakthrough.
I remember reading like 3 weeks into the conflict that more than 7,000 Russian troops have been killed, which is more than all of the U.S. service time from this effect. And so with that, would you say that there's a sort of sunk cost fallacy that's motivating the Russian military?
So, does everybody know what the sunk cost fallacy is? I think so. I'm going to say something really simple about this, which is that we often forget what the basic reason for having a democracy is. So democracy does allow you to be more free, and that's wonderful. But what a democracy also allows you to do is to rotate leadership. In the absence of a democracy, you end up in this Russian type situation where one person is in power for so long that it's unthinkable for that person, but also it becomes unthinkable for the country that somebody else might be in charge. And then you get into this classical situation of tyranny, which is described in, Plato's Republic, and it's been described in Shakespeare, and it's described regularly in like the whole Western canon, where you're less alert than you used to be. You're less capable than you used to be. You're worse and worse at taking the information from the outside. The things that used to be kind of your private peccadillos, like, for example, there is no Ukraine, suddenly move to the center of your consciousness and start to determine your action. And then once you take action on the basis of these strange convictions that you have as a tyrant, you then have to double down, because the one thing you cannot admit is that you're wrong. I mean, even in the democratic system, as one notices every day, it's not as though our politicians take great pleasure in talking about how they made mistakes, but they sometimes do. And ideally, there's a press to remind them of it, and there are electors to remind them of it. Russia now represents a kind of extreme of a situation where one person can make the most obvious, blatant, horrible mistake one can make. I mean, from every level, from the moral, the practical, the political, the economic, the military. I mean, Putin's mistake in invading Ukraine is an extraordinary mistake, right? It's an extraordinary mistake. I mean, to recast an old quotation, it's not just a crime, it's a mistake. But he can't say that, and no one can say it to him. And so that's the primary doubling down mechanism, is that, and it's true of everybody. I mean, all democracies and wars look like this too, but eventually they might check themselves. Putin, though, has to not be wrong. And what's worse is that he has to be right. He's still working under the assumption, if you judge from his speech by a few days ago, that there isn't really a Ukrainian nation. It's just the Western puppeteers, and the Ukrainian marionettes. And if you think that's true, then you keep thinking that if I just pound away, eventually the healthy Ukrainian masses are going to liberate themselves from the Western puppeteers. So he has way too much power. That's the structural problem. And then there is I mean, I think the society, as I'm judging from a very great distance, is getting into the sunk cost fallacy a little bit, where, you know, the sunk cost fallacy is that because you've already put something, you've already spent some money, therefore you must continue to spend more money because you've already spent some money, right? But I think there is that dynamic now where, because so many of us have died, it's more of a psychological thing. Because so many of us have died, we must have died for a reason. And so in exchanges with Russians, they can't seem to say what that reason is. Right? That's very characteristic, whether it's Russian soldiers in Ukraine, whether it's their parents back in Russia. No one can actually seem to say what that reason is. It's like, it's all dark hints and conspiracy theories and and we all know who the real enemy is, whatever. No one can say what it is, but there is the sense that, yeah, because so many of us have died, this, in some way, it's like comforting. It's like a horrible sort of comfort. So many of us have died. The president must have been right because so many of us have died for, you know, what he said. And so you get into this dark, terrible circle. Right. And I mean, now, rather than ending on a dark point like that, I just want to make a contrast between that and the Ukrainians, who, I mean, even during the war where this president is very popular, it's not as though people walk around thinking that he's always right about everything. You know, political discussion continues about other subjects. Corruption investigations continue. The press continues to report on other things. If you read the Ukrainian press, you know, as I do loyally, they continue to report on other things besides the war, including local news, right? And that generates a very different dynamic, which Konstantin has done such a good job of describing, where part of trusting one another is that you have a sense of reality, like you have a sense of what's actually going on in your country. And when people die, that's terrible, right? From a Ukrainian point of view, when people die, it's terrible. The war is terrible. It's terrible when people die. This shouldn't be happening at all, but we know why it's happening, right? It's not that the death itself becomes the reason for something. It's that the death itself demonstrates that we know why, right? We know why we're taking risks. We have some sense why my father or my brother or my friend died. Right. And that's a very different situation. So I'm trying to take your question also and turn it in the direction of showing a difference between these two societies at war, because the Ukrainians are taking horrible casualties too. But the way that they treat it, right, as a kind of confirmation that we knew we had to take risks because we know why it is what we're doing. That reveals a very fundamental difference. And if you'll forgive me making a larger point here, going back to Marci's questions about a year ago and what we've learned, this is not so much me, but like, I think the people in general, a year ago, people were still in the West struggling with what was different between Russia and Ukraine. They're both far away, you know, they both have unpronounceable languages, you know, they're both in Eastern Europe. What's the difference, you know, maybe they're ethnic Russians in Ukraine. Like, what's the difference really between these countries? And I think trying to figure out the difference on the basis of things like language and ethnicity, which, you know, hint doesn't really exist, on the basis of these like ancient continuities, that was always a mistake. And it was always a kind of tyrannical mistake, because once you talk about how there's language and ethnicity and culture that lasts forever, you're playing into the hands of the tyrant, in this case, Putin, who says, this is the way the world actually is. And because it's this way, I get to invade. Right? I say they're Russian speakers over there. I say there's a Ruski Mir. I say there's a Russian world, and therefore I get to invade, right? And I think too many of us went too far down that road of thinking that, well, it's all about language or culture or something. But like, if it's all about language, why aren't we invading Canada? Or why won't the Canadians invade us? Or like, whichever you prefer, right? It's ludicrous to think that the difference is all about language. The difference between Russia and Ukraine is about societal norms and practices and things like, is it all about the vertical or is it all about the horizontal? Do people distrust everything, or do they sometimes trust other people for good reasons? Like, that's the difference between Russia and Ukraine. It's not these things like language, like it's not these things like culture that we wanted to kind of impose from a distance. It's actually practice, and whether you trust people or not, and is there civil society, you know, can you make things happen? Those are the real differences between the two countries. Anyway, thanks for the question. I took it in some different ways.
I think there's time for one more question, because I know we're running out of time. Yes, please, the woman in the back. Yes.
So is this true for better answers psychologically, the experience, or authority, with that kind of that binary approach you described? Does that binary sort of it is sort of what it activated is just kind of self-sustained or apparent, or are there things that sustain that continuous building of trust and sort of reinforcing of trust, especially as we come to
I'm not sure I fully understood what.
Did you describe that sort of right at the beginning of the war, this binary is stepping off? That there's this really important idea of trust, is that something that sort of like when that is within this first 24 hours, right? Trust between like events. Is it something that like over the last year has been that there are sustain and building that trust, or is it sort of self-perpetuating system of people kind of continue
there's a history to this, you know, it's not magic. And it's a really interesting history because it reminds us that democracy is a kind of collective activity. You know, there are a lot of things that this war has reminded us, which for me, you know, as a kind of intellectual, if perhaps not political conservative, for me, remind me of the ancient discussions of democracy. You know, one of the ancient preoccupations about democracy is that it has to be collective, right? It's not a matter of going alone to a voting booth and like being all by yourself with your own opinions. It's about collective discussions. And the history of Ukraine in the last 30 years has been a kind of reminder of that. You know, Ukraine becomes independent in 1991. What does that mean? Well, you can have the institutions, you can have the constitution, but those things don't defend themselves. They have to be defended, and in defense, they have to be improved. And so then you have a series of events in Ukraine, 2000, 2004, 2005, 2013, 2014, in which in various ways, Ukrainians collectively defend their right to self-determination or their right to be represented. Their right to fair elections, their right to be who they are, their right to the rule of law, their right to sovereignty, their right to existence. But in this 30 years in which now most Ukrainians have grown up, or many Ukrainians have grown up, has been a time of, I would say, you know, increased trust. And Marci's book, Ukrainian Night, is largely about this. It's largely about the Maidan protests of 2014 as a moment, you know, when about 1 million people had a trusting relationship one to the other. And there's a notion in Ukrainian of like the Maidan friend, like the person, it's a little tiny bit like the Supreme Court justice and the homeless person, like the two people who would never have been together come together because there's some reason for them to be together. And then they kind of continue to trust each other or even be friends, even though in their normal, you know, individualistic life, they might not have known each other. So there's been, over the course of the 30 years, there's been a kind of accumulation of this. And one thing I certainly notice is that a lot of the people who are doing the civil society work now in 2022 were also doing civil society work in 2014. And that, you know, when somebody, like there's a lot of Ukrainians driving vans around, you know, the story of the tires and the train, that's an example of like how the whole country is trying to, like, you know, it's not a rich country. They don't have like deep reserves of anything, but there are a lot of people who are trying to get things to the right place. They're trying to collect money, get donations. And then once you get the donations, there has to be somebody driving that car, you know, to Izium. You're driving that car to Kherson, right? And like that, you know, and so maybe the person who's driving the car doesn't own the car. And maybe the person who collected donations isn't the same person who actually bought the stuff with the money, right? But the reason why you have those networks of trust is practice that goes back to 2014 or earlier. So there is a historical part to this, right? That there's been an accumulation of these kinds of horizontal relationships, which are now paying off. And again, it goes to this issue of what's like, and I'm not trying to say like Ukraine is great or perfect, you know, but it goes to this difference between Russia and Ukraine, where when you see and my colleague Natalia Gumenyuk and other journalists have written about this, but there's a particularly excellent article by Natalia Gumenyuk and Applebaum in The Atlantic a couple of days ago about this. Russian soldiers in Ukraine don't understand how Ukraine can exist. because Ukraine seems to depend upon people doing things together without anyone telling them to do it. And they just don't think that's possible, right? Their first move is it must be Zelenskyy who's telling you to do it, right? Or it's like Biden told you to do it. Biden told you to clean the trash off the street. No, Biden didn't tell them to clean the trash off the street. They self-organized to clean the trash off the street. And that's, by the way, not a trivial example when you're constantly being shelled, that like people have to get out and fix the roads, which the Ukrainians do. They get out and fix the roads. But that's so this trust is a historical phenomenon. But then I think, as you're suggesting, it does start to have a self-reinforcing character. I mean, maybe there's a tipping point, right, where you start to trust people even though you haven't had a historical relationship with them. Okay, I bought you some time if you want to say something.
I think I want to offer just another difference between Ukraine and Russia that I see as a crucial one. I think that we value death way less than we value life. And I'm not sure about Russians at all. And I think that our whole objective is to survive and live and thrive. And we subordinate all our decisions for this, notion of life, family life. Ukrainians love their families. The role of woman in Ukrainian families actually very different from the role of woman in Russian family. That was another phenomenon that we faced when we tapped the phone calls of occupying force calling back their mothers and wives and receiving signals to go and rob, go and kill, fight as men, and not come back before you bring me something valuable. That's what they heard from their women. Ukrainian women are very different. It's just a different story. And the political part of it is that I genuinely see that Putin made a lot of mistakes, but while making a lot of mistakes, he still thought of himself as of a rational actor. It's just that his dimension of operation is very different. I think that he sees this fight as a fight for votes, but not from the votes of those who represent Russia now. I think that he sees his only constituents, whom he accounts for in next generations. He's not interested in getting votes right now. He'll make any result, any result he wants. 80%, 80%, 90%, 90%. It's just a matter of pushing a button on a really low and a really large phone on his desk and his decision. But he still believes that he's going to be judged by the next generations. And since he abandoned all the efforts to give Russians more civilized, that only 30% of Russians domiciles have actual bathroom. You know that? The rest, 70%, have holes in the ground out of the house. Only 15% Russians have travel passports. Only 5% of them have been abroad. This is actually a prison of thoughts, of knowledge, of exposure that limits their outreach hugely. So I think that he realized that he's not able to transform Russia, modernize Russia, make Russia great in present life, and he's working for what he sees interests of next generation. And by and by these, he sees a great value in collecting landmass and doing all the colonizing, occupying work that he's trying to do. That's just my perspective, and I still think that this is something that we should consider while we try to understand his actions, his motivations, and the limit to both. Because the question of how valuable Ukraine and war in Ukraine to Putin is a big question, because it helps us to predict with more or less clarity how long this war is going to last. My opinion, that is going to last very long before he is completely defeated in Ukraine. Maybe.
I mean, I agree with you. I think that Putin, no, he's concerned about how he's going to remember it after he's dead. I think that's the thing. I mean, this difference, this distinction you make between caring about death and caring about life is very important. I think Putin is concerned about being remembered as another Peter the First. You know, I think he's concerned as being remembered as a great Russian leader. And when that's your concern, it's not only the lives of Ukrainians that don't matter to you, it's the lives of Russians that don't matter to you. I mean, and this is a tough one, because people want to say, well, I care about the interests of Russia, I care about the Russians. But if you care about the interests of Russia, or you care about the Russians, you should want them not to die pointless deaths, you know, and that means trying to end this war as quickly as possible. And there's only one way to end this war, and that's for the Ukrainians to win it. But I'm really struck by this point as well, that there really is this strange sense that it's only like the Russians have no ability to articulate what this war is about, and they need the death. They need the death to create the meaning. Whereas for the Ukrainians, it's the meaning was already there, and the war has made people maybe more active or more efficient or more trusting or better able to cooperate with one another. But the meaning was already there. And when I've talked to Ukrainians, you know, this has struck me over and over again, that nobody says the war is about Russia. The war is about Ukraine being what Ukraine is supposed to be. You know, that there's a future which is better than the present, and that this war has gotten in the way of that future, but that we are still capable, and perhaps even more capable than we were a year ago, of describing what that better future is going to be like. So the problem with the war is it's not Russia exactly, it's that they are getting in the way of us being the country that we should be. That's the problem. And that's a big, profound difference, because I think deeply Russia is fighting this war because for no reason. Like, it's the absence of reason. It's the absence of knowledge of who you are. It's the Ukrainians who are teaching the Russian. Russia has this fantasy that Ukraine is the anti-Russia, but I think it's really become the other way around, that Russia is the anti-Ukraine, that it's Ukraine, it's suffering and dying in Ukraine, which is creating a sense of what Russia is, and not really very much beyond that. Whereas in Ukraine, it's not, you know, this has been my very limited experience. It's not that. It's that people have this idea, you know, as Konstantin says, at the level of individuals and families, of freedom, meaning I want to do things so that they're a little bit better than they were before. And this terrible thing is getting in the way of that. And I remember who I am because I remember how I want things to be better. And when we get through all of this, then I'm going to be the person who figures out how to make things a little bit better.
Thank you all so much for coming. I know you only have 4 minutes to get to your 1:30 classes. Thank you so much for Alexei and our students for organizing this. And hopefully we will meet under more cheerful circumstances.
Thank you so much, speakers, for coming and speaking today. And thank you all for coming and spending your afternoon with us. There are 3 items on today's agenda that I will also want you all to know. First, We will have lunch reception with the speakers at HQ 131 right after this event. Pizza and drinks will be served and everyone is invited, so please join. Second, at 3 p.m. today, we will have the Vigil for Ukraine to commemorate the 4th year of the full-scale war. It will happen at 3 p.m. on Cross Campus. Senator Richard Blumenthal and Mr. Usov will be speaking there. And lastly, you all received placards with fundraisers, so please donate and help purchase generators for the hospitals. Thank you for coming.